great to be here and to see all of you. And I have to say, I do a fair amount of these, and this is a wonderfully intimate room, so it's good to be here, and it's great always to be with Tom. I think just apropos of the Foreign Policy Association, it would be nice to start with issues of international concern, and certainly cultural heritage is top of the list. And I always think about, to what extent, what is a museum's role, given that this issue has taken on greater urgency in Syria and elsewhere, and how much a part of your sort of agenda or day does this consume?
I think we can talk so generally about the role an institution like the Met plays in introducing people to the culture of other parts of the world, introducing so many people to so many different things. But it sometimes sounds a bit like platitudes. And I think one of the events that really brought home to me the reality of this impact was when we opened our new Islamic galleries in October 2011. So almost 10 years to the day, not quite a day, but certainly 10 years after 9/11, the sort of the shadow that hangs over New York and indeed over the civilized world. We had closed the galleries down some years before because of construction going on below and above. It was an opportunity to totally rethink the art that we showed from the Islamic world. And as we thought about the galleries, we broke it down. The art of the Islamic world is actually the art of many different cultures in different regions that evolved in different ways at different times. So we decided to present the collections in a totally different way. A lot of work. Fast forward, we opened the galleries. From the moment those galleries opened in 2011, we've had a constant stream as if it was a temporary exhibition. And what has been remarkable to me is the desire, the hunger, almost the hunger that our visitors have to learn more about the parts of this part of the world that for many of them was absolutely unknown, and which, because of 9/11, was being presented inevitably in the press, very often very polarized terms. And here we had an opportunity to give a much more nuanced, thoughtful way in for people to understand the great cultural heritage and traditions of Islam. So I think that was the moment for me where the responsibility that we carry really struck home to me in a new and fresh way.
Wasn't there a very long name for it at first, and because you wanted to make sure to not alienate any particular aspect?
Well, I think, yes, one of the issues that came forward in the whole planning was that this catch-all term, Islamic art, was very misleading. That we had art from Iran, from Turkey, from the Ottoman Empire, from the Persian Empire, from all of these different areas. So we made a fundamental decision, and it lives this day, that when you walk into the galleries, it doesn't say the galleries of Islamic art. It says the art of the Arab lands, Turkey, Iran, Central, and later Southeast Asia. It's a mouthful, but when you read it, it's a geographical entity, or entities, and it's logical.
Well, what about, given Palmyra and this question of looting and repatriation, to what extent is that something you have to get involved with or worry about?
We've watched the events unfolding over the last 2 or 3 years in Syria and then in Iraq with ISIL, with increasing horror as some of the most important cultural survivals of the ancient world, both cities, monuments, and works of art in museum collections, have been either accidentally damaged in passing by bomb damage, or have been more recently actively targeted by ISIL. I think we collectively feel very powerless. And that was brought home to many of us, about a year ago when ISIL started systematically destroying historic sites in Iraq. I think there was a moment where many of us spoke out, and we realized very quickly that we were simply pouring fuel on the flames, that after its horrendous depravity, its physical torture and abuse of individuals, the Western media reached a point where it decided not to propagate these images anymore. And I think ISIL maybe realized that they weren't getting the coverage they had got, the impact from that. So then they turned to cultural property. We all reacted, we fed the flames. I think subsequently we realized that it required a more moderated response. But then what can you do? What the Met has done is, in conjunction with colleagues like the British Museum and the Louvre, first we've worked with our governments here with the Department of State, trying to support efforts to monitor illicit looting, to prevent the illicit trafficking of such goods into the West, into Western collections. Again, there's only so much you can do. What we have done more recently is that our curators, who know so many of the people on the ground in Palmyra, they knew that poor gentleman who was killed for refusing to reveal the whereabouts of some of the works of art. So they feel so personally engaged here that many of them have spent their careers studying these very buildings. They hosted, we can't bring colleagues, obviously, from Iraq and Syria here to train them or to help them. So instead, we hosted a symposium in Istanbul, and where it was more easy for them to come, to hear from the people on the ground what we can do to help. And what came out of that meeting last fall was, firstly, a need for moral support, for contact, which we can easily give. But second, practicalities, like they need the equipment to photograph and record objects that from their own collections. They have the most rudimentary knowledge of what is in their collections. So we've set up a kind of a cataloging package that includes laptop computers and cameras that we've now got some support, and we're starting a kind of seed project to disseminate these packages to colleagues on the ground in Syria and Iraq. Proportionally, it's small beer, but hopefully it's the start and the continuation of dialogue and engagement that, when sanity returns, will be the basis, the foundation of re-engagement, further engagement.
To what degree have you had to deal with countries wanting their objects back? And I mean, there have been examples when the Met has returned things.
Yeah.
Has that happened during your tenure much?
We've returned a number of objects. In some cases, we've, through the ongoing process of cataloging, evidence has emerged, or new evidence has come to light that makes us feel that the circumstances in which an object came to the Met might have been inappropriate. It's a very small number of objects. The vast majority of the antiquities at the Met came to the museum in the first half of the 20th century through a process called partage, where Western institutions sponsored excavations in countries around the world, but a lot in the Middle East. And the process, at the end of each season, what had been found would be divided between the source country and the sponsor institution. So that's where many of our great Egyptian collections, for example, come from. That system was discontinued after the Second World War. And then after the Second World War, there was an enormous development in the trade of antiquities. And of course, as we now know, looking back, that was an era in which perhaps a sort of don't ask, don't tell, where many objects entered the international art market through illicit excavation and through illicit export, which resulted in increasing scrutiny by the press, increasing self-consciousness by the establishment in the 80s, 90s. And as a result of that, we've all now changed our collecting practice. We have very strict guidelines. So the Met, of course, has had some high-profile incidents in the 90s and early 2000s. By and large, I think we have a much more stable situation. Perhaps what is more interesting now, the new aspect, is that with the developing wealth of the emergence of middle class, educated middle class, larger educated middle classes in Latin America, in Africa, in Eastern Europe, and in Asia, we're seeing an explosion of interest in history and art and culture in these regions, and the emergence of hundreds more of new museums, new cultural centers. And it's clear that where in the past, so much of the movement of art was from around the world to Europe and to America, that will no longer be the case. In the future, there is now this huge collecting going on around the world, and our future is in partnership and as peers with these new organizations. And so my colleagues like Mike Hearn, the head of our Asian department, in a way, the role of our Asian department is there's so much now more to and fro collaboration back to China, back to India, back to Japan. So I think that's one of the most fascinating aspects of our work going forward. And of course, there's a sort of cultural diplomacy element in this.
I actually spoke to Mike Hearn this afternoon because in my column on Friday, I'll give you all a little preview, we're writing about the fact that the Met is deaccessioning more than 700 Chinese ceramics, and they're going to be sold at Christie's. And I think for the average reader, they may not understand that actually this is part of a very natural and sort of necessary winnowing process that goes on in any cultural institution, and it actually comprises just a sixth of all the stuff you have. But can you talk a little bit about how you come to those decisions and how you kind of keep this collection active and current, acquiring and also deciding there are some things you're ready to part with?
Yeah. Well, coming back to the remarks I made in my introduction, what is amazing, and it's really thanks to donors like this audience and your generations before you, we started with nothing. And today we're one of perhaps the greatest encyclopedic collection in the world. And that's come from the generosity of collectors giving works of art to the museum, and the museum judiciously buying and to some extent selling. And in the case of Asian ceramics, we were fortunate to be given early in our history some very large collections of ceramics, and then over the years have acquired subsequent and even better pieces. And so our Asian department has been involved in a process of analyzing what are the absolute star pieces, what are the A, the B, the C, and identifying pieces that are duplicates, slightly damaged, of lesser importance. So we are, in this particular case, in the extraordinary position of deaccessioning quite a large body of amazing Asian ceramics because we have such a big collection of even better pieces. But if anyone is interested in Asian ceramics, you have a treat in store because there are some lovely things that are being deaccessioned. And it's, of course, I should say, it's all done under we're very careful about the process. It's done through...
You said outside experts you consult.
Outside experts.
Take the time.
It's done through auction houses. So it's a very transparent process.
You have become director at a time when, I know at the New York Times, things are changing under us daily, where we've moved from a a largely print operation to a digital one, and clearly you're faced with similar challenges. And what has that been like in terms of how your mandate has changed, and what you see your job as kind of comprising going forward? And is it very different from what you started with?
In a way, I think that is the fundamental question, or the fundamental issue that is changing all of our lives. We're living through a revolution, the digital age revolution, which is more, well, I guess it was pretty impactful when you were all sorts of revolutions in the past. But we're living through a revolution that is as dramatic as anything that has happened to previous generations, and is changing the world more radically and faster. It's changing the way that we process information, the way we do business. It's changing the way that we engage with our audiences, and it's changing the ways in which our audiences engage with what they expect of us. So I've had the privilege of leading the museum during this period of ferment, and of trying to help usher the museum from an analog, basically being an analog institution, into being a fully digital institution, where we have, behind the scenes, we have fully modern systems, and front of house, we have not only our physical presence, but we have the museum online. And the challenge to that is the expense. It's hugely expensive. We've been very successful in the past in raising money for exhibitions and publications and educational programs. But as yet, although so much money is being made in the tech sector, the people who've made a lot of money have not yet become major
cultural donors.
Yeah. So we're still, it's a bit catch as catch can. But I think we've made very important advances. Why do it? Because our mission is to be, to educate, to teach people about art and its importance. And through the internet, because of the internet, our audience is no longer just the physical audience who comes to the museum. It's potentially a global audience. And I think that it's important for many reasons. It's important because I individually can, as a former tapestry historian, now get the scholarship and the works of art I cared about so much online and reach new audiences. But much more broadly, and all of my curators with each of their areas can do that, but much more broadly, we live in this shrinking world because of cheaper travel and because of the internet. We've never been so connected. But we've never been so connected to misunderstanding and discord and the horrible propaganda of ISIL, or revolting, all the horrible things that are on the internet. And I think that we live in an age of radicalism, of phobias, of reactionary nationalism. And so an institution like the Met, with its global cultural perspective, can help provide information and take this question of understanding on the road. So to me, it's a critical mission that obviously echoes what so many of you in this organization are vested in on a political and educational basis.
I know that on one level, the Met sets the agenda for us culturally as, arguably one of the world's most important institutions, but you're also responsive to your audience, and I think that's something that you've brought as part of your tenure as an important kind of part of your thinking that you want to integrate without necessarily just pandering. But clearly, contemporary art has been one of those things that you've wanted to make more of a priority. Talk about how that's going with Met Breuer and,
Sure.
And why that was important to devote resources to that.
Well, the Met was set up to be an encyclopedic institution. that collected everything from antiquity to contemporary. And we were very active collecting contemporary for the first 30 years of our existence. We had contemporary artists on our board, Frederick Church, for example. We collected contemporary artists like the Hudson River School, Sargent, Whistler, and so on, all now old masters. We famously pulled back from collecting contemporary in the early 20th century, about 100 years ago, because the art that was coming out of Europe was just too radical for the tastes of the leadership in those days. And we didn't really get back into collecting contemporary, modern and contemporary, until after the Second World War. In the latter part of the 20th century, we built up a certain collection with some real highs in it, but also many gaps. There were other gaps in the collection too. Latin American, Native American. So when I became director, it seemed like a good moment to step back and think again about what that encyclopedic ambition meant. And it was very easy to identify. We were very strong in many areas, but there were certain areas where we didn't have the same excellence as elsewhere. Modern and contemporary was a big part of that. So amongst other things, I've had an agenda as director to expand our programming in this area in balance with all the other ambitions of the museum. One of our problems is that our modern galleries are quite limited in scope. So when shortly after I became director, learnt that Leonard Lauder had approached the Met to see if we would be interested in occupying, taking over the Breuer building when the Whitney moved downtown. It sounded like a very, very interesting possibility. And it was not something we rushed into. The board members present here this evening will remember long discussions that we had over a long period of time about the pros and the cons. But we basically decided it was a very exciting idea, so we came to a legal arrangement with the Whitney late in 2012. Sheena Wagstaff joined the museum shortly thereafter and was charged with heading up a program, working with colleagues like Mike Hearn, that would be distinct to what MoMA and the Guggenheim and the others were doing, would be about modern and contemporary, but in this broader context. So that was the goal we set ourselves, and I couldn't be happier. I think the building, we've spruced up the building, looks as good as it's looked since 1966. We've launched with one exhibition that is about modern and contemporary in this longer historical context. Another exhibition looking at an artist from outside the familiar Western canon. These are just two of the thematic strands that we'll be pursuing. But for us, it's a new laboratory to be a bit experimental in, to let our hair down a little bit, maybe to make a few mistakes, but you only learn by making mistakes. And in the meantime, we're looking at the possibility of rebuilding the modern galleries and the main building. So it's a very exciting moment.
For those who might say, we have the Whitney, the Guggenheim, MoMA, why does the Met need to do this when it does so many other things well? What would you say?
It's part of our original mission. Our audience wants to see modern and contemporary at the Met. And what we do is different to our peers.
Explain how.
Well, because MoMA, the Guggenheim, the Whitney, the New Museum, they all show modernism in the context of modernism. And they do it each in their own way superlatively. What we do is show modernism and contemporary in the context of these longer historical traditions, both in depth in history and in the breadth of our encyclopedic holdings. So it just feels very different. And I think you get different resonances, different insights. Neither is better than the other. They're complementary. So I think what the Met is doing in New York now with this new expansion just helps make New York the leading center of modern and contemporary in the world at a higher, at one notch higher.
I have to say, for those who haven't been there yet, it is amazing, if you're familiar with the Breuer Building, to kind of walk in and juxtaposed with modern art to see Titian on the walls. It's just mind-blowing, and it is something that only you guys can do. Just in terms of the world we're living in and competition for our time, I think we all worry about the next generation of museum goers, and just museum going seems just by nature a more sort of contemplative, slower act, and we are in such a fast-moving world of competition for our time with a lot of options. And you hear constantly about performing arts institutions struggling in terms of planning ahead and subscriptions. And to what extent are you worried about just being able to sustain what you do at the level at which you do it, and that there's going to be an audience and patrons who are there to support that work?
I think that people worried that when TV networks started televising sports, they worried that people wouldn't bother to go and watch sport anymore. How wrong they were. What TV did was to build and expand the audiences. We live at this exciting moment where the internet will, I believe, build and expand our many audiences for art and for culture and for history. Some people will never come to the Met, but ultimately, the highest form of engaging with art is being face-to-face with a work of art. It's different to what it looked like on a screen. It's bigger, it's smaller, it's dirtier, it's brighter. There is something awe-inspiring about being in front of the delicacy of a watercolor that Dürer painted 500 years ago, having taken 2 months to get across the Alps, for example. It just being in front of I Instagrammed a photograph the other day of a little shard of limestone I'd never seen before in our Egyptian gallery. And it had been found in a scrap heap by a tomb, and it was a sketch for a portrait of the person who was buried in that tomb. And the artist had crisscrossed it so he could measure it up to the full scale and then thrown away the sketch. It's one of those moments that just transports you across time. And I think in this age of information overload, a place like an art museum, a gallery, it is in many ways, it's the modern day religious experience. It's a moment of transcendence. It takes you outside of yourself. It replenishes you, it refreshes you, it inspires you, it connects you with your past, inspires you for your future. So I think that our role has never been more important. So yes, we have to juggle the books, we have to balance the budgets, but I and my colleagues, we have such a privileged role at this moment of tumultuous history.
I think it's also, the fact that you were Tapestry Tom for so long, and now you're Instagramming. You've come quite a long way. But
yes.
One of the things that you have talked about, and just in closing, is that you want to make this place less intimidating. That you actually want to, you're straddling both. You want to keep up these standards, but you also want people to feel more like they can come up those steps, and it's open to everyone.
Yeah, exactly.
No matter how much you know already.
We were set up to be, it's said in our opening, founding statements that we were to be a museum for the masses. And now the masses might not be quite the right, it doesn't have quite the right intonation, but the concept was that we were to be open for everybody. And that I think is, again, every generation has to go back to reinvestigate, reinvent the founding mission. But I think that, for all the reasons we've talked about, there's the confusions, the differences, the misunderstandings, that fundamental educational mission is more important than ever. So, I think we have to find ways of. We hear a great deal from people who love the Met, but we also need to listen to people who don't feel comfortable there, to understand why they don't feel comfortable. And if there's something we can do about it, let's do it. So let's get teens in. Let's let them make a lot of noise. Let's find ways of, making people comfortable, not being intimidated, all that art history jargon. I mean, I'm an art history jargon buff, but many people find it intimidating. Parents who are afraid to go to the museum because they're worried they'll be shown up. They don't know enough in front of their kids. These are really fundamental problems that but we can find ways of overcoming them.
Thank you, Tom. It's great to have had you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you.